Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. I'm still trying to understand why we're going to have to pay more than $2 a ride on the subway. So I've invited a distinguished professor of civil engineering and the director of the University Transportation Research Center at City College, Robert Paaswell, to explain. I'm sorry to do this to you.
No problem.
But why are we going to have to pay this increase?
Well, basically because it costs more to operate the system. I think one of the, in all the recent arguments about the MTA and why fares have to go up and why we have to build new lines and everything else, the one thing that hasn't been in the table is what kinds of service should New Yorkers have in a world-class city? What that means is how often should the trains run? Should they be crowded? Should you get a seat? Where should the buses reach to? Should there be connection between the Long Island Railroad and Metro North and the transit system? And once we decide what that service is, should we wait 15 minutes for trains at night or half an hour, as those of us on the west side of New York find we do, and then they're crowded when they come? Or should we have them, as they do in Paris, every 2 minutes without fail? You can set your watch by it. Or in Hong Kong, every 2 to 5 minutes, you can set your watch by it. How do we get service like that? It's expensive. We have to pay for it. Now, transit is very expensive for two reasons. The first reason is it's very labor intensive. You have drivers, you have mechanics, you have people that operate the trains, people that take your money, so it's very labor intensive. And secondly, the equipment you buy is very expensive, and it has to be renewed. It's like anything else. It lasts so long and has to be renewed. So there's a long-term continuing expense of maintaining transit. And those of us in the business, I'll skip over a lot of things. I won't throw any math equations or do any economics, and basically say I always like to draw the analogy between a candy bar. If you, a 2-ounce candy bar might cost $1 to make. And if you give the person who's making it 80 cents, you're going to get an 80-cent candy bar. You're going to get a smaller candy bar, or you'll get one of less quality. Well, every trip that you take on the transit system costs more than $2 to provide. Some of it comes through subsidy, a lot of it comes through fares. And if you give the transit system less money, you're going to get fewer trips or poorer service, and that's sort of where it is.
But the transit system is like the circulatory system in a body. It's essential for everything.
It's the key for it. It's my business, the transportation business. The city, it's as essential to the city as is water and electricity.
Exactly.
The city can't operate without transit.
So we've really botched it up because we're putting the burden of financing it on the riders, aren't we?
Well, a lot of it. It's continually been, in the last 10 years,
or neglected.
Been shifted to the riders. Yeah. 10 years ago, a little more than 10 years ago, there were a lot more subsidies from the state and from the a little bit more from the federal government, but more from the state and more from the city. And the city and the state have pulled out hundreds of millions of dollars of financing and have reduced the mechanisms by which we can perhaps find other ways of financing it. Nobody likes to use the word tax, but everybody would like to get the service of public transportation. What we've got to do to find ways of paying for our transportation system is rethink who are the people who should pay and who are the people who benefit. Now, certainly, everyone who uses the transit system, when I come down here to be on the show, or when I go up to City College for my job, or when you go for your job, you ride the transit system, and you assume you're going to be able to have good, quick service to take you where you're going. So in one sense, the ability of you to hold your job depends on the quality of your transit system. Look at it in the reverse. Every employer wants to locate in a place where they can have access to this great labor force. And New York City is so unique. We've done studies of New York, and it's compared it with peer cities all over the world. There's no place like New York City in terms of the diversity of employment and the wealth generated per capita of people working in the core of New York. So you put that all together, employers really want to be in New York. And they can be in New York because they can attract not only the most technical PhD to work on high-tech computer stuff, but they can have service workers, restaurant workers, mid-level people, salespeople to sell them the computer cords and everything, all within this little area, and that's all because the transit system goes. If the so some of us are beginning to feel that the beneficiaries of this, who are the businesses, the residential, the real estate developers, other things, are also people who can make their living based on the fact that we have a great transit system. So we have to begin to look at ways of shifting the burden out to other players. And some of this, of course, is in the form of taxes. And it's frustrating when all you hear is no new taxes come up, and yet people want this great service. And the irony, of course, is you can't have a service unless you pay for it. It's a public good. It makes the city work. It makes the city unique, and without
So in a way,
funding
it's regressive by raising the fares. I mean, in a way, that's like the sales tax, because the person who's making the lowest end money is the person who's going to have to spend the added money to get to work.
Well, I felt it was very ironic in 1 week to have everyone say, let's raise the fares on the transit system. Same time, let's not raise the minimum wage for the workers.
Right.
So that's a double whammy on the most crucial workers.
So whose fault is it? It seems to me there are two things I wanted to talk about. Is the current organization of the transit system in New York the best organization with the MTA? And the other thing is, who's really responsible for this? And I think it's the conflict or the tension between the need for long-term planning and the need for expedient results on the part of elected political leaders.
Right. Well, we do know strategic planning here. I mean, nobody looks
There's
at the
never
long
any-
run, and
yeah.
no one says, other than looking at the Olympics, which is a whole other subject that we probably don't want to get into
They
today.
want the Olympics, so they'll do everything.
Nobody's looking 10 or 12 years or 20 years down the
Right.
line and say, what will New York be then, and what should we invest to make it that way? All these new projects that they want in transit projects, they're sort of looked at a project for the west side or a project for the east side,
And they also
but they don't look at them together.
And they don't mix their planning. I mean, they do economic development. They want to do economic
Right.
development in outer boroughs,
But it doesn't.
but it
no.
doesn't connect with necessarily
let
what the results are from the.
Okay, let me.
me go. Go on.
There's too many thoughts on the table.
We both wanna talk.
Let me. Well, I'll
Go
listen
on.
to
No,
you.
it's all right.
can
No,
rest for a
I
minute.
have you here because
Right.
you're the expert.
Let's first talk about the idea of strategic planning. As you know, we worked on a study for the New York City Partnership in which we looked at 8 to 10 different proposed rail systems
Right.
to look at are any better than the other. But the one thing absent from all that, and which we brought to the attention not only our client, but all the organizations that we talked to all the city and state organizations, was that you can't look at these as singular projects. You have to look at groupings of these to see what is best going to enhance the future of New York. If you build the
those-
7-line extension, you're going to hurt Lower
But those
Manhattan.
projects were the Lower Manhattan, the Second Avenue subway, the West Side extension.
The East Side access, airport
Right,
access,
okay.
the Fulton Street
Right.
station. And some of it was like apples and oranges. We didn't look at any freight projects, and
Mm-hmm.
maybe later in the show we can talk why that's really probably, I think, the most critical issue that we're
Yeah, I
just,
wanna
we
talk
just
about
put
that
under
because-
the
right.
table. Now, but basically what you've got to do is look at groupings of projects and say, if New York is going to sustain its global competitiveness, its economic advantage, and continue to be the job-creating thing, where should these investments go? Not should, if we plop something over here, will it create investment over here? If plop something there, will it relieve congestion there? How do you weigh against each other? How do you weigh a new job created because you're extending the 7 line, and let's say you do that and you build a convention center, you create a new job, versus perhaps a job lost because you don't build the Second Avenue subway, congestion increases, and employers move to New Jersey or to Colorado or someplace else. How do you weigh the two of those? Those are things that aren't coming to the table. So these are all critical factors. But let me back up and suggest something before we talk about strategic planning, looking to the future, that sort of gets lost in the argument, although now the MTA is going to bring this up. And what I want to suggest is that before you even add on to the system, it has to be running well. It costs a lot of money to maintain the system in good operating condition. Just as we like to maintain our houses, or most of your viewers, probably a large number of them have cars, and they know it costs money to keep a car going. If they don't keep it going, it's not going to work. Well, transit system's the same way. You have to replace expensive buses and rail cars every few years. You have to put in new signals, new switches. People are dying for little signs on the subway platform that say the next train is coming at 2 minutes or 3 minutes. The technology is there. All that's very expensive. So the MTA has a word for keeping things in good repair. It's called state of good repair. And it costs a lot of money to keep things in a state of good repair. And a number of us feel that you have to keep things in a state of good repair. Your system has to be like new before you can begin to add on to it. And what we see is as the budgets decrease, what happens is you're expanding maintenance out a little bit too much. We've seen cars without air conditioning during the summer. Cars' doors don't work on the trains. We've reduced service. I don't know if, I'm sure a lot of your listeners would probably know that maybe the buses don't run quite as often, or they don't run quite as late at night. Well, every bus trip that's not there, even if it's on a route that's not as dense as you'd like it to be, means that you're depriving somebody of a trip or access to the city. And in the long run, enough of those people are depriving somebody of operating their candy store, their restaurant, or their employment center. So all of this hurts. And it gets back to the fact that we haven't brought our system up to the kinds of operating condition that you see in some of our global cities. It's not because the people running the agencies, the Long Island Railroad or the New York City Transit, don't know how. They know what to do, but they're handcuffed.
Does that money for maintenance and keeping it in good repair come out of the expense budget or the capital budget?
No, that's all out of the operating budget. The capital budget, the operating budget is sort of, that was my candy bar example.
Yeah.
Your trip
Right.
comes out of the operating budget.
Right.
But the problem with the operating budget, you mentioned the capital budget, and I think it's important to make the distinction. The operating keeps things going day to day. The capital budget is to buy new rail cars or build new extensions and things. The capital budget, it comes primarily from subsidies and from the issuance of debt, the selling of bonds. When you sell bonds, you have to pay interest on them.
Right, so that cuts out of your...
Every transit system, almost in the world, with the exception of New York, pays that back out of a capital budget. New York pays back that out of the operating budget. So instead of having $1 for operating, you have $1 minus the interest. So you have 85 to 90 cents on the dollar. So again,
why does that happen? That's state
that's because it's just the way legislators agreed to pay back the debt, and it's something that I think you're a question. Again, too many ideas, but let me back up and say one of the questions you raise is organizational questions. The structure of the MTA that was started, in the 1970s, was a structure. It's a same structure that most transit organizations around the United States have, and it's called an authority model. You have an authority that oversees and sets budgets and has a contractual obligation, and then reporting to that authority, but integral with it are what we call operating units: the transit authority, or the suburban rail, or the suburban bus. And those people operate the system based on budgets that they're given by the oversight authority, and based on levels of service, or how much should you provide, 24-hour service, or 12-hour service, or peak hour or not peak hour. And those standards are all set by the authority, and then the agencies themselves then run these things. The reason that they set up the RTA, the MTA, were a number. One is that you wanted to integrate suburban and urban systems. And they wanted to do it at a time when state legislatures were becoming increasingly suburban. So you had to sort of balance the ability to get money from suburban legislators into a system that served a lot of suburban riders, but who paid taxes in suburban districts. So you had to find a way of getting money in to something like the transit authority that has 80% of the ridership, but might only have 70% of the tax base or something like that. So one is to make this blend between suburban and urban. The second reason that you formed these transit authorities was to form state governments that could issue debt that's outside the usual state debt limit. Mm-hmm. And that's really what it was about. So the model of funding for capital programs became the issuance of debt, selling of bonds, and then I think when New York was in its fiscal crisis, they felt that one way to back the bonds, they're different. You can sell bonds because as a bondholder you want to know it's guaranteed by something. One way to guarantee them is saying on the full faith and credit of the government. It'll come out of the state treasury. Another way to do it is by saying it's fare-based bonds. So you'll know that if somebody's paying fares and the bond is defaulting, the money's going to go to the fare rather than the upkeep of the system. So what they sort of had a combination, but the bottom line is that the agreement during the state's fiscal crisis was that in order to repay this debt, if they wanted to spend as much capital as they could on renewing the system. This was under Connolly, renewing the system, and then using what they thought were very small amounts of the operating budget to repay debt. And the sense when they first did that was that maybe 5 or 6 years they'd repay it out of the operating budget, and then it'll go up. But the amount out of the operating budget is increased. It was a bad model. So what we've got to do is we've got to go and revisit the whole act that creates the MTA. We have to say the MTA that was created in the 70s were problems that existed in the 70s, and now we're in let's say the year, by the time it's restructured and thought about, it'll be 2010, and we have to think, what is the MTA going to provide in 2010? What kinds of financial instruments does it need? Does it need new financial instruments? Should the MTA, by legislation, have a cap on the amount of operating revenue that can be used to pay debt? A number of us feel it should be maybe between 5 and 10%, if no more, and then decreasing over a period of time. Should there be a fare box recovery ratio? When I worked in Chicago, the RTA there, by RTA statute, said that the operating budget, the transit systems should have a fare box recovery ratio of 50%, or 50 cents on the dollar come from that, and then the state would guarantee that the other 50 cents you need for operating funds would come from a variety of state subsidies, which would include taxes and everything. You also, I think the other thing that the MTA is, and I'll give you a good example of this, is the fact that it has to look at new kinds of financial instruments. And one of them is to begin to deal with real estate. Hong Kong, the Asian places know that if they own the real estate, rather than getting rid of it, they can get tremendous amounts of money on real estate. So let's take a fictitious example of the far west side. Supposing the MTA owns a very valuable property on the far west side. Would you sell it for a one-time hit of perhaps market value, but who knows what the market value is? Or would you say, we're looking at a capital budget. Capital budgets are 20 years in a horizon. Maybe that property is going to increase in value over 40 to 50 years. So maybe what we really want to do is have somebody buy a lease for 99 years or 50 years or something.
Is that like the airports with the Port Authority?
Yeah, same kind of thing. In other words, pay a fee to use that property and then pay a lease in which the value is reflected in the increasing value of the property. So instead of getting 600 or 700 million on the job, they could get over 40 years probably something that's worth several billion in terms of present value. So this is real money that the MTA needs. It's not a trade-off of one favor for another favor. It's real money that's needed there, and if that's just one example, and if you could set a number of real estate examples, perhaps I was suggesting to someone on one of the newspapers the other day that if when you build a Second Avenue subway, there might be some property that you have to condemn to build stations or anything. Well, after they condemn it, the MTA should actually own it and then release it out to developers, the same kinds of models that they use.
That's how the developers made all the money years when it first started, wasn't it? They bought the land themselves.
They bought the land and they developed it. And it's being done.
If they had bought it for the transit authority, it would have been a different story.
There's examples all over the world to do that, and they're great examples. So, I mean, there are ways.
Well, we have 10 minutes or less. God. How do we take hold of this? I mean, what happens is the MTA says we have to raise the fares, so everybody gets angry at the MTA. Then the mayor comes in, he says you have to cut salaries and increase production.
That's nonsense.
It's total nonsense. It's outrageous, isn't it?
Look, you have structural debt approaching billions of dollars. Maybe it's 800 million, whatever, but you have structural debt approaching billions of dollars.
So it means in a couple of years we're going to.
You could cut 100% of the staff.
And
you can get rid of everybody, and you won't have that. I would suspect that, and I work very closely with all the operating units at the MTA, the Transit Authority or Metro North. These are great people, and they're working very hard.
And they're very committed and dedicated.
Oh, very, very much so. And they probably have the same percentage of slackers as does somebody on the mayor's staff or the governor's staff. I mean, that's human nature, and so nobody's to blame there. So you could squeeze everything you want out of it, and you'll find you're not going to save much. You also, I think one of the things, it could be an anti-labor posture too, and I think that I would not want to get on a bus unless I knew it was being driven by my neighbor, or get on a train unless I knew the conductor on my train was my neighbor. Somebody committed to the city, bringing their children up in the city, working in the city. Somebody committed to the system. I don't want to contract it out or find that somebody's grumpy because their salary has been cut from $14 an hour to $7.10 an hour. So the point is you want to pay people what they deserve, and if you think of the fact that they're carrying 7 million people a day, and other than the fire that they had last week or an incident that's so rare that it makes the newspaper, that they're doing miracles in running this. So you have these dedicated workers. So you're not going to save money that way. It's a red herring that says, hey, the city maybe doesn't want to pay anything for this. What the city would like to do is see new service provided someplace. But my feeling is in order to do that, they have to recognize that both operating the system and the new glamorous things are part and parcel of the same thing. My fear, Ronnie, my fear is that, and as somebody who loves New York and doesn't want to see all these wonderful things leak out of the city, is that New Yorkers aren't, they're not going to riot in the streets if their system isn't any good or do anything. What did they do during the 70s? They moved. They moved someplace else. So my fear is if you continue to have crowding in the Lexington line, and if we don't really do anything about not raising the fares and decreasing the service, but raising the fares and providing more service than we have. We've already had service cutbacks over the last year, and people, I think people would go to their bus stop and find it's not coming as often as they can, or we're not providing as many trains off-peak as we should, recognizing the city is really a 24-hour city. So we need to increase the level of service, modernize the system, basically put money in the system. And if we don't do that, we're going to find that employers are going to find, hey, the coast of New Jersey look great. I'm going to move there. I'm going to move to White Plains. I'm going to move to Arizona.
So we have to go after the mayor. We have to go after the governor. We have to go after the members of the state legislature.
Absolutely.
They've got to look at this and see if the current mechanism is adequate to control, to really deal with the problems that we face.
What they have to recognize...
And they're going to have to find more money.
Yeah, what they have to recognize is the money that they're playing with now, this money in their hands, is money that's generated because we have this amazing thing called public transportation in New York City. Not like any other city in the world.
Is there any other city in the world that has a successful transit authority where it runs without...
Hong Kong. And they generate a lot. They have a whole real estate division. They generate a lot of money.
And the
from real
fares
estate.
there are?
Fares there are the fares there are relatively high. If you do the fare as a percentage of average take-home pay, fares are higher than in New York. Fares in London are higher than New York. But the service you get is different. And all the studies we've shown say people don't mind paying higher fares. People will pay higher fares if they get better service for it. What they don't want is what they're seeing now. They're being asked to pay higher fares, and at the same time, they're getting these are the package of cuts. We're taking people out of token booths, we're closing stations, we're reducing the number of buses.
But how do we increase the planning? How do you make that a major issue? I mean, here we are with an influx of immigrants coming into the city, which means they're looking for jobs. They're going to start low-paying jobs, most of them. They're moving into the city. They're living here. How are we going to support them or accept that increase and still not plan for it?
I think a lot of it is on rest of the private sector. Again, I think that we need to see more people, more of the local businesses and not-for-profit organizations and the big organizations step up to the plate and say, this is vital to our health here. Everybody who runs a theater district or the restaurant association or all, Time Warner who sells all the cable around, the partnership, rather than saying that they don't want new taxes, should get in and say new taxes would make sense if we can say for every dollar new tax we're going to get X return on our investment in terms of improved transit and an enlarged labor force. Right. The alternative is that 10 years from now they're going to find they made wrong decisions. The labor force is not going to be around, and they won't be here. We won't be here for us to yell at them. So
it's a part of a holistic approach, which remains the greatest frustration.
Well, there's some of us out there are we're beating our fists on the table to get them to know that.
Do we look at traffic generally and how we're moving? I mean, your field is very broad, but you yourself are not doing vehicular traffic.
There are a lot of people in my center that work on traffic problems and traffic models.
Now, you're a United States funded regional center.
Right.
So it seems to me in almost every city I've been to in this country, there's a terrible traffic. Yeah. What are we going to do about this?
Well, congestion, my colleague Lee Sander at his Rudin Institute just had a conference on congestion, and the bottom line is congestion is with us. And I always like to cite, when I was in Rome, I picked up a book by Josephus, The History of Rome. So he's talking, Rome, BC.
Right. It was
and he says a guy opened his apartment or whatever they called in those days, door, and he walked out. He couldn't get onto the streets of Rome because there's all these animal carts and people and hubbub. Congestion sort of represents levels of economic activity. So you wouldn't want to locate your store where there is no congestion. Congestion becomes a problem when the costs of congestion begin to make people move away. So in one sense,
Right.
it's reflective.
You move further away,
Right.
but then if you don't have mass transit
Right.
to
Then you
answer
right.
it,
Well,
then
move
you...
away. I mean, move away from the area. I don't mean just have mass transit. So that.
No, I mean if they move further away from the
Right.
from the area, then they're still going to drive. It's not going to...
Yeah.
I'm sorry. It's another program.
But I think that the congestion problem is probably less important in New York now than is really looking at the strategic investment problem. We've got probably $30 to $50 billion of investment needs. Where do we put the first dollar? I mentioned, and I hate to let you go without, and again, it might be another problem, without talking about the fact that one of the big causes of congestion, the number of trucks on our street, and that moving goods in and out of our area is a critical thing, and it's becoming too expensive to do.
I remember a futurist society 40 years ago that said deliveries of trucks should happen at night. We should have a dual kind of... 40 years ago.
People still think that, but nobody wants to take delivery at night. So that's the building owners. It's not the truckers.
Right.
So
we're practically at the end of this program. What we're saying is the MTA should be reorganized. We have to find additional streams of revenue that are reliable
and long-term.
And not just dependent on ridership. Right?
That's right.
The higher the ratio, it's inverse. Is the higher the rates, will there be fewer riders?
Well, when the fares go up, there's always fewer riders. The fares go up. For every 10% rise in fares, you lose 3% of your riders.
So people should write and call their legislators, write and call the mayor and the governor, write and call the local representatives who represent them, and demand that there be some planning and some attention paid to this.
They should write before they move away. That's the important thing they should do.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Professor Paaswell. I'm sorry
Thanks.
it's gone so fast, and I hope you'll come back
We
again.
just started. Right?
I know. All right.